written and made arrangements for basically an Oxford Group convention to be held in Akron at the Mayflower Hotel, no less. And it was a rip-roaring success. The Oxford Group is now in Akron. The event was several days long, and they left behind a couple of people to help them start meetings. They called them house parties. You know, they didn't call, I keep saying meetings, but they actually called them house parties. And so they left a couple of people behind to help start some meetings. The house you see there belonged to the couple you see in the bottom picture, T. Henry and Clarice Williams. We're going to talk about that in a minute. One of the places where they had a meeting on Thursday nights was in the West Hills section of Akron, Ohio. And there were some important people to us that were attending that Thursday night meeting in the West Hills section of Akron. Our very own Dr. Bob and his wonderful wife, Annie, as everyone called her, and a woman named Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta Seiberling was born in Kentucky. She was raised in Texas. She was the daughter of a judge. She was crazy smart. She graduated from Vassar College when she was 15 years old with a degree in music and a minor in psychology. And she married the son of the founder of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Frank Seiberling was the founder, and his son John, and they got married. And that's why she was in Akron, and she was living at what they then called the Seiberling Estate. And her marriage was strained with John, and she had attended those Oxford Group meetings. And she had actually moved out of the big house and was living in what they called the Gate House or the Gate Lodge on the property of the Seiberling Estate with her children. So after one of these Thursday night meetings, a woman named Delphine Weber, who we don't know anything about really, other than her husband worked for the school system, but that's about all I've been able to find out. And we don't know why she knew this, but she comes up to Henrietta, and she says to Henrietta, she says, "What are we going to do about Dr. Bob?" And Henrietta says, "Well, what do you mean, what are we going to do about Dr. Bob?" She says, "Well, he's a drunk. He's a terrible drunk. He's going to lose his practice. He's going to lose his home. He's going to lose everything. What are we going to do about Dr. Bob?" Well, Henrietta thought she was close with Dr. Bob, but apparently not that close. She didn't know about his drinking. And Henrietta was the kind of person who you didn't have to guess where you stood with her. You knew. She sort of wore her feelings on her sleeve. She was very kind of, you knew where you stood with Henrietta. She was a doer. She was not somebody that could just hear this information and then not do anything about it. So she had to spring into action. So she devised a plan to get Dr. Bob to talk about his drinking. One of the things, I guess it's too strong a word to say a criticism, but one of the things that kind of turned her off about the Oxford Group meetings was that the level of sharing just wasn't deep. It was just superficial. And she wanted sharing at a deeper level. So what she did was she went to T. Henry and Clarice, and I got a feeling she kind of voluntold them that we're going to have a special meeting at your house on Wednesday nights. And by the way, this would be the predecessor to what's considered AA Group number 1, the King School Group, which still meets on Wednesday nights in Akron. So this is how it originated. And so her plan was they would have a smaller meeting, which of course Dr. Bob would be included in, at the Williams's house. And she would try to draw him out to talk about his drinking. So in Henrietta's words, we're going to let her explain her little plan here and what happened.
And so we did all share very deeply our shortcomings and what we had victory over. And then it was silence, and I waited, and I thought, will Bob say anything? And sure enough, he said, well, in this deep, serious tone of his, you good people have shared things that I'm sure are very costly to you. And I'm going to tell you something that may cost me, may cost me my profession, that's the thing. And alcohol's always laughing. And he said, I'm a silent drinker. And I can't stop.
So that's what Henrietta's plan worked. Dr. Bob started talking about his drinking. And so now what to do about it? They all prayed for him. They got on their knees and they prayed for Dr. Bob to stop drinking. And several weeks go by. And this would be in the spring of 35. And the Oxford groupers would have their quiet time, and then they would receive guidance, and then they would share their guidance with each other. And Henrietta calls Dr. Bob one day and she says, "I've received some guidance on what to do about your drinking." And Dr. Bob's all excited. And so they get together, and Henrietta says to Dr. Bob, she says, "Bob, my guidance is that you should never, ever touch another drop of alcohol." That was it. That's her guidance. You know, Dr. Bob obviously was disappointed, like he didn't know that. And he just kind of bowed his head a little bit, and he says, he called her Henry. He says, "Henry, do you believe that I want to stop drinking?" And she says, "Well, of course, Bob, I know you do. With all your heart, I know you do." And he says, "I really do." He says, "I just don't understand it." And then he said something really important. He says, "Nobody understands it." Well, that was about to change in just a few weeks. Meanwhile, back in New York, Bill has got a house full of drunks. He's running around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to get alcoholics sober. Towns and Silkworth allowed him to roam the halls of Towns Hospital, but nobody's getting sober. Nobody's getting sober, and he's getting frustrated. And he got a couple of pieces of advice that most of us are familiar with. As he was lamenting one day to Dr. Silkworth and Lois, not at the same time, separately, you know, nobody's getting sober. And Lois says, "But don't you see, Bill, you're staying sober." Ooh, idea, hadn't thought of that. And Dr. Silkworth, who is normally very kind of reserved and quiet, not a in your face kind of guy at all, he sort of bore down on Bill, and he says, "Well, I'll tell you what the problem is, Bill." He says, "You're scaring them." Because Bill was coming on to him really hard and talking about his spiritual experience and all that. He says, "You're scaring them. You're talking about your white light experience. They can't get away from you fast enough. You got the cart before the horse. Hit them with the medical facts and hit them hard. Let them know the hopelessness of their situation. Then gradually bring in the solution." And so these ideas are planted in Bill's head. Now, Bill still wasn't working. And although people in Lois's family were delighted that Bill was sober, Lois is working her tail off at a department store. And so there's starting to be these little mumblings and grumblings about, is this Bill ever going to get a job? And, you know, and Bill heard that, and it kind of hurt his feelings a little bit. So he went sniffing around Wall Street, and he ran into a proxy fight that was right up his alley. Bill had an incredible business mind. A sober Bill Wilson on Wall Street would have been a millionaire many times over, but we're so glad that he decided to devote his life to Alcoholics Anonymous. So he gets this proxy fight, and it's out in Akron, and him and a couple other guys go out there. And there are some historians that can give you a blow-by-blow of everything that happened over those few days in Akron, Ohio during that proxy fight and what went wrong. And it turns out, I'm not that interested in it. All I know is it fell through. But it turns out the other side did some underhanded and probably illegal stuff. And this just stuck in Bill's craw. This thing was a slam dunk, and they just pulled it out from under him in an illegal way. He was not happy about it. So they left Bill. The other guys went back to New York. They left Bill behind to see if he could salvage anything. And this is that iconic moment in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, Mother's Day weekend, 1935. And we're all familiar with this scene from reading it in the big book. Bill is pacing the lobby, feeling a little sorry for himself. And there's a bar with he could hear the people drinking in there and laugh, and he could hear the ice cubes hitting the sides of the glass. And he wanders over to the door and just sort of peers in there, and he says, well, maybe I can just go in there and have a ginger ale. I go, "Oh, no, can't do that." So you all know the deal. He's back and forth, and he had seen a church directory. And when he felt like he was going to drink, because he wandered back to that door again, and he said, "Maybe I can have just a couple." He knew he was on thin ice. We didn't have a second step then, but Dr. Silkworth had made a really good job of explaining to him it's the thinking preceding the drink that is the problem. So he knew that. He knew he was on thin ice. And he thought, if I get drunk, what'll happen to all those drunks that will never get this message? And in his story, he says, and then sanity returns. So that tells me that an unselfish thought, much less an unselfish action, will expel the obsession to drink. So he goes to the church directory and he makes a call at random. He randomly picks one of the clergymen on there, and he makes a phone call. And we'll let Bill explain what happened.
And I thought to myself, now I need an alcoholic just as bad as he could possibly need me. I'm in danger of getting drunk. I must find another alcoholic in this town, and right now. I called a preacher. He was a little puzzled that I was a drunk from New York who wished to find some drunks to work on. Drunks one at a time seemed enough to him. But he finally caught on, and through a series of providential circumstance, I'm face to face with Dr. Bob in the home of a non-alcoholic. One who understood, and one who cared enough. Dr. Bob and Ann had entered that room at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Bob couldn't stay but a minute. But we talked for 5 hours. And this time, there was real mutuality. I told him at once, please stay. I need you as much as you could possibly need me.
I need you as much as you could need me. Powerful words. So Dr. Bob and Ann come over for dinner at the Cyberlings. And after dinner, which Dr. Bob didn't eat, Henrietta wisely puts them, just the two of them, Dr. Bob and Bill, in this library. And that's where they spent those 5 hours talking. And if ever you go to Akron, I mean, everybody should experience Founders Day, but if you want to really take in the historical sites, go any other time but Founders Day. I've sat in this room for as long as 45 minutes, totally uninterrupted, and just contemplating what happened there 19 years before I was born. And if you'll notice, the clock in the back is at 5 o'clock. And whenever I'm in that room, it's 5 o'clock, Mother's Day, 1935. And it's just incredible what happened in there. Going to go ahead and move on here. Dr. Bob had one more drink in him. Bill had moved into Dr. Bob's house a little bit in a couple of weeks later, and they were running around trying to help drunks and hammering out the ideas of what would become Alcoholics Anonymous. And Dr. Bob always attended a medical convention in Atlantic City, and when that came up, he asked Bill and Ann, should I go? And Ann, being the smartest one in the house, said, no, you shouldn't go. That's everybody just gets drunk there. No, don't go. And Bill said, well, we got to live in a world where there's alcohol. I think you should go. So let's let Dr. Bob tell us what happened.
But very shortly after that, there was a medical meeting in Atlantic City. And I developed a terrific thirst for knowledge. I had to have knowledge. So I would go to Atlantic City and absorb lots of knowledge. I usually mention the fact that I incidentally had acquired a thirst for scotch, but I didn't mention that. But anyway, I went to Atlantic City and really hung one on. And when I came to, I was in the home of a friend of ours in Cuyahoga Falls, one of our suburbs. Bill came over and got me home. Gave me a hooker or two of scotch that night and a bottle of beer the next morning. And that was on the 10th of June of 35, and I have had no alcohol in any form that I know of since.
Haven't had any alcohol in any form that I know of since. So this is Dr. Bob's official sobriety date, and the birth date of AA is recognized as June 10th, 1935. Dr. Bob wound up at his nurse's home. That's where he was, and Ann and Bill went and got him and brought him home. And in that room you see on the left there, Bill sort of, just helped Dr. Bob through the weekend. He gave him some K-Rose syrup and stewed tomatoes, just this awful stuff. When you go visit the place, they have some props set up for you. Anybody who hasn't been to Dr. Bob's house, please do. You'll really, really enjoy it. They've done a great job up there. They're just wonderful people. I have a few more slides to go through, just kind of a nice little ending. Dr. Bob's official birth date, or AA's official birth date, is June 10th, 1935. Dr. Bob actually was performing surgery that Monday morning, and Bill and Ann drove him to the hospital and dropped him off, and went back home to wait, and were really worried. And he called and said the surgery went fine, and he'd be home in a little bit. And there's some discrepancies about what time he actually wound up back at home. Some say around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Some say it was much later, like 10, but it was long enough where it just worried the heck out of Bill and Ann. They thought, oh my God, what is he doing? Is he out there congratulating himself? Because right before the surgery, Bill had given him a bottle of beer and what they called goofballs in those days, probably some barbiturates to steady his nerves for the surgery. And there's a couple of things you probably shouldn't do on the day of your last drink or your beginnings in AA. One is perform surgery, and the other one is to run around town making amends. And in A Vision for You, there's a clue as to why Dr. Bob might have gone on that last drunk, because there was one thing he balked at, even though we didn't have an 8th and 9th step. Part of the Oxford group was restitution, and he balked at that a little bit, and then he got drunk. He says, okay, check that, I'm all in. And so that's that. And I just wanted to, usually what I do at the end of this, but I felt like you all wanted to wrap it up, so that's why I stopped. But I'm happy to do it. I love doing this. I fast forward a little bit. In 1948, Dr. Bob was diagnosed with cancer, which eventually would take his life. And in 1949, his wonderful wife, Ann Smith, who we owe so much to, by the way, she doesn't get talked about enough, her or Lois, really. We owe everything to them. Bill and Bob would never have made it without those two. And in those early days, over the summer of 35, it was Ann who was leading the meetings in the mornings when Bill and Bob would bring drunks back to the house. And it was her that kept encouraging them and pushing them on. So we owe her a lot. And she passed away, sadly, in 1949. In 1950, we had our first international convention up in Cleveland. Dr. Bob was very sick and very weak. A New York AA named Al S. would be tasked with getting Dr. Bob from his house in Akron up to Cleveland to give what would be his last talk. It was a short talk, and this is just a little piece of it that I think is really important. Dr. Bob was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words meant something.
Our 12 steps, when simmered down to the last, resolve themselves into the words love and service. We understand what love is, and we understand what service is. So let's bear those two things in mind. Let us also remember to guard that airy member of the tongue. And if we must use it, let's use it with kindness and consideration and tolerance.
Sometimes Dr. Bob is thought of as being the tough one, the tough love, the hard guy. And I hear that and I think, no, Dr. Bob was filled with love and all he ever wanted to do was help. 3.5 months later, in the first part of November in 1950, Bill makes one last trip to 855 Ardmore to visit with his dear friend, Dr. Bob. These two men really grew to love each other. And what a divine mix of personalities we had here. Bill was the only guy on the planet that could draw Dr. Bob out of his comfort zone. And conversely, Dr. Bob was the only guy on the planet that could put the brakes on some of Bill's big ideas. We needed both of them really, really bad. When Dr. Bob was diagnosed with cancer that they knew was going to be terminal, Bill got a little bit of a reality check. In 1938, they had started this thing called the Alcoholic Foundation. It was the predecessor to the General Service Board. And the link between the foundation and the groups had always been Bill and Bob. The average AA member at that time probably couldn't even tell you who was on this foundation. And so when Dr. Bob was diagnosed with cancer, that got Bill's attention. He ain't going to last forever, and I'm not going to last forever either. What's going to replace us? What's going to happen? And this is when Bill, with some help, hatched the conference idea, the idea that we have today, the areas, the districts, all of that, and a general service board. But the folks in Akron were really cool to those kind of things. Dr. Bob's son one time, giving a talk, said if it had been left up to the Ohio crowd, AA would have never got out of Ohio. And if it was left up to the New York crowd, AA would have been on the New York Stock Exchange. They would have franchised it. Of course, those are exaggerations, but there's a grain of truth in there. The Ohio crowd wasn't even crazy about the big book. Nobody was really behind it all that much. I mean, they voted for it, but okay, Bill, you go back to New York and do that. None of them bought any of the works publishing stock or anything. They just were content. So it was really a tough sell to get the Ohio crowd to move in on anything. So part of Bill's visit this day to Dr. Bob was to get him to endorse this conference idea, because he knew without Dr. Bob's endorsement, it would go nowhere in Ohio. And contrary to the movies where you see Dr. Bob laying in bed and Bill sitting next to him and Dr. Bob can barely speak, Dr. Bob was up, he was dressed in a light gray suit, and he and Bill talked for hours that afternoon. And finally, Dr. Bob agreed with Bill that the conference was worth a try. And he said that he would endorse it. And they walk outside, and they're on that, standing at that porch where you see Bill sitting. And Dr. Bob says to Bill, he says, but it has to be AA's decision, not ours. And Bill agreed, yeah, that's right. But he did endorse the idea. And they shook their hands and they looked into each other's eyes, and both men knew they had made their last decision together as AA's co-founders. And Bill walked down the stairs you see Dr. Bob sitting on, and when he got to the bottom step, Dr. Bob says, remember, Bill. And Bill stopped and turned and looked at Dr. Bob. He said, don't louse this thing up. Let's keep it simple. And Bill was overcome with emotion. He couldn't really speak. He just managed a wink and a smile and a thumbs up, and he turned and he walked away. And in fact, Dr. Bob would pass away the following Thursday. I'm so grateful that Providence saw fit to bring these two men together when they did. 19 years before I was born, these two guys started working on something that saved my life. And I'm so glad that none of them gave up on doing that. And I'm so grateful that Bill and the others had the vision to keep this thing going through our traditions and our concepts. And the conference that he was trying to sell the Ohio crowd on is exactly what's in place today. That is Alcoholics Anonymous. We are Alcoholics Anonymous. And it just always touches my heart to think how these people were taking care of our lives way back then without knowing us. Many of us weren't even born yet. So I never want to forget the obligation that I have to carry that message on.
May God bless and keep you, and Alcoholics Anonymous ever.
Wow. Thank you, Mike. What a wonderful journey, taking us back and seeing how this all developed and where the message comes from that we pass on today to new people coming into the program. Today we had 1,271 years of sobriety on the call. The least amount of sobriety was 3 weeks. Welcome to that person, enjoy the journey. And the longest amount of sobriety is 53 years.
Oh my God.
So that's terrific. Okay, let's wrap up today's meeting. Mike, a huge thank you for taking the time to be with us and to share this, incredibly important aspect of the beginnings of AA. And I know everybody has really enjoyed it. Let's close out the session. Let's close the session today with the responsibility statement. I am responsible. When anyone, anywhere reaches out for help, I want the hand of AA to always be there. And for that, I am responsible. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful gratitude month, whatever your celebrations are. And we'll see you all in February. Take care.